All right, and we're live. Assalamu alaikum, Imam Khalid. How you doing?
Salam rahmatullah. Alhamdulillah. I'm doing very good, Brother Musab.
So this podcast is a very long time coming. We tried to launch it before Ramadan, and I mean Allah is the best of planners. So here we are, several months later, later than we hoped, but Allah is the best of planners. Inshallah, there's benefit in the timing, but now that we're here, we can finally have these discussions that are so necessary. So I'll ask you right off the jump: Untold stories of Islam in America. What does that mean to you? What do you imagine when you hear that?
That's a very interesting topic because I would dare say that most of the on-the-ground stories of individuals and Muslim organizations and events that actually shape the development of Islam in this country are untold stories. A lot of research has been done, some excellent books have been written about the history of Islam, say in the 20th century in this country, but still, the majority of the stories are still untold. And not that I know all of the stories, but I have a few myself.
Well, I think that I was off Facebook for a long time because I got on Facebook when I was quite young, and I used to just think of something and post it on. And so when I was moving on in life, and those things could come back to bite me, I got off Facebook. But when I got back on a couple years ago, I think it was a couple years ago, uh, I was very cautious about who I like the different groups that I joined, and I ended up, you know, making a lot of friends on or adding a lot of people on Facebook who are of your generation. And I know that um, your generation is quite active on Facebook, but now I dread checking Facebook because it's like after a week I log in and I learned that another person from another African American Muslim from your generation has passed away. And it's like every time you hear this devastating news, it's more devastating, not just because, the loss of a life and the loss of a Muslim, but knowing that what that person saw and what that person did, it is imperative for Muslims in America to know that story. And so many of these brothers and sisters pass away and take their stories with them. And I think that we, as the immigrant Muslim community, even though I'm not an immigrant, I'm the child of Muslim immigrants. I feel like a lot of times, at now that the Muslim community is established a little bit more than it was 50 years ago when you embraced Islam, I feel like a lot of times we're very dismissive of that generation of African American Muslims from the 70s and the 80s who embraced Islam wholeheartedly and did the work that no one was wanting to do at that time. There was no notoriety when you became Muslim and became a street dawah guy or sister doing that work in the 70s. There was no notoriety, there was no social media. There was an element of sincerity there that I think a lot of times nowadays is much harder to maintain because of the amount of cameras and the social media and all that stuff. And when I sit down with you and other people who come from that same background, I mean, I've come to learn that I think the 1970s and 1980s might have been the greatest era of Islamic revival in the Western world. And it has, I think, very little to do with immigrant Muslims. I mean, certainly there were some contributions, but I don't know who characterized it this way. Islam in America started as a uniquely African American experience. And so that's why sitting down with you and making this a priority for Mabel Muslim Alliance for Black Lives, I think that's what I really am hoping to capture because you have your own story, but also Allah has seen fit to put you in certain places at certain times, and you have encountered and interacted with a lot of tremendous people. And so I think this is an opportunity every week for us to uh, hear some of your stories and inshallah even bring on some of your friends, some guests, and hear these stories because the larger Muslim community needs to know about them. So I was
Yeah, I think, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm really
Please.
appreciative and grateful for Muslim Alliance of Black Lives starting this endeavor, and for your being the moderator for it, because as my Blackistani young brother, you have an appreciation for the work that was done by the African American Muslims and Latino Muslims during a time when the work was not as widely known as you alluded to, because of there was no social media. The presence of social media today can have a guy sitting in his house, uh, just broadcasting, and you think this person is something else. But I've jokingly referred to myself over the years as the Muslim Forrest Gump, because, as you alluded to, Allah has placed me in situations over the years, over the past decades, where otherwise I would feel completely out of place. Well, how did this dude show up in this place and in that place? And so this is a wonderful outlet to share some of those experiences and just reflections on how that impacted me personally, and how, in my analysis, how certain events impacted the growth and development of Islam in the U.S.
I want to ask you. I think one of the core principles of us practicing Islam as a community is having the imam, right? Uh, I think what is traditionally understood to be the leader of the community, but I think these days with the expansion and the growth of large suburban mosques, I think the if you ask a young person today, like who maybe under 15 or under 20 years old, if you ask them to define what imam is, I think they'd probably say he's the guy that leads prayers at the masjid, and the masjid board hires him and the masjid board fires him. And I I think in the African American Muslim community, I think the African American Muslim community has managed to uh, you know hold the role of imam still somewhat traditional. But I was going to ask you, who was the first imam that you met after you became a Muslim in 1972?
The first Imam that I met was Yusuf Muzaffar Hamid, who was the Imam of the Masjid al Ummah, a community mosque, which was located in Washington, D.C., Northwest Washington, D.C. And he had the dual role of being at that time the Amir of the Islamic Party in North America. Yusuf Muzaffar Hamid, by the accounts of anyone who met him, was an extremely charismatic leader. He was very articulate, he was very expressive, he had very strong opinions. But one of the assets that Brother Muzaffar had that was outstanding to me was his organizational ability. He was a tremendous organizer. My father was a union organizer, so I grew up in a trade unionist household. And my father used to tell me stories about union organizing and just organizing in general and who were the best organizers, rather than telling me stories about, financial achievements and investing money. So when I met Muzaffar and was around him over the years that I was in the Islamic Party in North America, he was the second best organizer that I think I've met in my life. I'm a little prejudiced, but I really feel my father was just tremendous, because he was drawing from past experiences and past struggles in the civil rights movement, but also in the trade labor movement. But Muzaffar was, if he was anything, he was a tremendous organizer, and I think that in itself helped to put the Islamic Party on a course in the early 1970s, starting in 1971, December of 1971. But through these early decades of the 70s and throughout early years of the 70s and throughout the decade of the 70s, I think his organizational capacity, his Islamic experiences, his knowledge about Islam, kind of set the organization apart in some very positive ways.
What were his credentials to become imam?
Um, Muzaffar credentials, and it's an interesting phenomena, but uh, when with the development of Islam in the African American community, the process of one becoming an imam at that time was not that you be a graduate of Azhar or Medina University or any of the universities, Islamic universities in Malaysia or on the African continent. Primarily, uh, the genesis of this development, starting in the late 60s and 70s, was the person who the imam would be the person who showed perhaps the most commitment to trying to bring other Muslims together, having, of course, a knowledge of Islam. And I say knowledge of Islam based on the availability of information at that particular time. Because when I became Muslim, except for pockets of the United States, like in New York, where you had a number of immigrant Muslims coming into the country, and there were maybe a couple of bookstores and things like that. Information was a premium. And Muzaffar had the benefit of having traveled throughout the Middle East, um, starting in 19 probably 69, and he was over in that part of the world for about 4 years. He had gone over ostensibly to study at an Islamic university that I can't recall the name right off. It wasn't Medina U. I don't even think Medina University was established at that time. I can't remember the name of the school. He ended up getting kicked out of the school because he was organizing protests there at the university, and so they gave him the option: either you stop what you're doing, or you got to go. So he left, and it
Which
was a
country
good thing
was it
for
in?
us. This was in Saudi Arabia, and
Okay.
he was organizing some stuff, and they didn't like it. They kicked him out of the university and probably out of the country. But it was a good catalyst for the development of Islam, particularly in DC and across the country with the Islamic Party, because he was able to travel, and he traveled to Pakistan. He was a guest at one time in the house of Maulana Maududi. He was very he was a kind of an oddity at that particular time in Pakistan and all of the countries, Egypt, where he was around the Ikhwan members. But his travel gave him a perspective of Islam that oftentimes is so missing in the general Muslim community. And in those formative years, it was definitely missing. And that was of Islamic movement, that Islam is not just a religion in the traditional sense of the word. It was a way of life, but the mission of those who embraced Islam at that time, because there were so few above board Muslims in the United States, that Muzaffar instilled in us, because of his experience with various Islamic movements, that our role as Muslims was to share this faith, to organize ourselves in a way that we would try to impact not just the personal growth and development of individuals, but to help try to change the society, to project an alternative living and an alternative way, which was based on submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
And so you enter in 1972, correct?
Yes, it was my first semester of my senior year at Howard University in DC. And I was married when I entered into the party. I got married at the beginning, at the right before the start of my junior year. So I already had a wife when I came in. And so that side of discipline, I think I sort of had that down because I was already married.
But so It's interesting that you presented this understanding of Islam, because I think that a lot of times what Muslims are grappling with today is, and I'm talking about folks who are born and raised Muslim like myself. I think a lot of times what we grapple with is, well, Islam is just a set of spiritual practices and some morals and beliefs. But from my discussions with you and your peers, it was vastly different. Like your what you did 7 days a week was that, well, first of all, you mentioned that your outlook and your purpose in life was now something completely different than it was before. But like, what were some of the, I guess we know that when you became Muslim, you started to practice the mandatory Islamic acts of worship like prayer, fasting, and all those things. What were some of the additional responsibilities that you had undertaken after becoming Muslim in 1972?
Mention that because the understanding in the Islamic Party in those very early days, it was a relatively small group of people, brothers and sisters in Washington, D.C. But the understanding that we developed in the Islamic Party was that it's fine. You learn Salat, the Zakat, you do all of the five pillars and those things, and Salat is the foundation for everything that we do. But that was the entry level. We did those things identify in order to identify ourselves as Muslims. But Islam required much more from us. And so we were meticulous in trying to learn the basics and make sure that we were satisfying the minimum needs to even call ourselves a Muslim. But that was the starting point. And just quick reflection, what has happened so often that I've seen over the years in this country is that um, the mentality of learning the particulars and specifics to such a degree before you can engage in any kind of work, it was something that those of us who became Muslim in that era just looked at. Those things were essential. We had to do it. That was the beginning, just the sure point of entry into the world of Islam. And if you could just ask me the question again, because my mind was jumped off track. I was going
Like,
in a direction.
what I asked, in addition to your mandatory acts of worship, like your prayer and your
Right,
fasting, what
right,
other responsibilities did you undertake as a Muslim?
right, right. Very good. You know, um, Dawah, the call to submission to Allah, was a bedrock for everyone who became a member of the Islamic Party. We considered ourselves a Dawah organization, and in that regard, we had a publication that was distributed nationally and even internationally called Al Islam, the Islamic Movement Journal. And this publication, at that time, I have to say, from an indigenous Muslim standpoint, was the most consistent, regularly produced, and we felt a high quality publication. Of course, this was in the old cut and paste days where you would typeset something, you have to lay it out. It's very unlike what goes on with digital publications now. But this publication was our calling card, and we were able to use that in other brochures. But the Al Islam publication was the calling card in which we introduced Islam and the Islamic Party, the work of the Islamic Party, to the overall community. So we would go out, and at one point, I had the responsibility of leading a Dawah team. Dawah, when I came in, I guess because I talked so much, that Dawah was my immediate first area of responsibility. And so at one point, we had 14 brothers that would go out into Washington, D.C. 6 days a week for 8 hours a day. And all we would do was just meet and greet and talk to people about Islam. share a little crazy story here. We would go all over the place. And so at one point, we were going down in front of this big department store on K Street in Washington, D.C. It was a big, very, very heavily populated area with people, all the businesses down there. We would set up a downward table and stand on the corner. We would have materials there, and we would, you know, try to address the people there. And our style of dawah in those very early days was that we would be out there and we would, there's no God but Allah, Muhammad is his messenger, you know. And a couple of my friends from Winston-Salem, North Carolina, where I was from and grew up, were in DC, and they saw me out on the corner hollering the way that I was. And when they went back to Winston-Salem, they told everybody, man, Griggs, I'm going crazy, man. I saw this dude standing on a corner in DC just shouting, had this paper in his hand. He's lost his mind. We refined through the um, refinement process, through training and through Muzaffedin's direct input. We refined that shouting at people approach to just quietly easing up to people, sir, ma'am, do you have a moment? And this was much more effective. But my responsibility initially, and for most of my time in the Islamic Party, was in the area of dawah, whether it was in the media, TV, radio, giving lectures and this kind of thing.
Included prisons as well. Had to give dawah in prisons.
Yeah, yeah. As a matter of fact, in 1972, when I embraced Islam in September, by that time in 1973, and even before September of 73, I had started going into Lorton Federal Penitentiary, which was outside of Washington. It was interesting there that if anybody committed a crime in the District of Columbia, because it was a federal kind of district, area, you had a felony. So you could commit purse snatching. You had a felony, and it was interesting. And all of the persons who were convicted in D.C. went to Lorton. And so I went down in about mid 1973. I started going into Lorton, meeting with the brothers, not so much visitation on the individual level, but conducting classes and sharing the little bit that I knew about Islam at this point. So one of my earliest experiences as a Muslim was working with brothers who were incarcerated. And from that starting point, over the years, I ended up doing a class, a monthly class in Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary. I was going to Hagerstown, Maryland. I was all over the place, wearing my little raggedy cars out, but very enthusiastic because the brothers in prison had it was a captive audience for Islam. And I tried with others to try to take advantage of that play on words of captivity. That you got a captive audience, literally and figuratively. Yeah.
Can you tell us about? Wait, I want to ask you first. Okay, so the year is 1972 or 1970. Let's say 1973.
Uh-huh.
And you're leading a group on the streets of Washington D.C. And a young man walks up to you, and you can tell he's a young African American brother who's in college, and he's well dressed, and you can tell he's headed to class. And you can talk to him, and you have about 2 minutes. What pitch do you give him in 1972 or 1973?
1972, 1973 to African Americans, our pitch was first that
No, 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 no.
um,
You're you're looking when you're looking in the camera right now. You're talking to this young
right.
man who's walking to class.
Oh, okay, okay. Brother, do you have a second? I'd just like to take a second of your time and explain to you this, talk to you about this revolutionary way of life called Islam. It is the soundest vehicle that for African American people, it has spiritual, physical, ideological liberation. And pause at that moment. And the pitch at that particular time was consistent with the times itself because it was a very socially turbulent time in the United States. And there were so many competing ideologies and philosophies out on the streets trying to just garner the attention and even membership in different kinds of groups. So our appeal was specifically directed when we talk to African Americans about the liberating qualities of Islam, that it's not a man made philosophy, that this is something that when we look at the history of this way of life, we see that it was not something that was forced on people of African descent like Christianity was during the period of enslavement in this country, but it was indigenous to us because we were a part of that first movement to establish Islam in Mecca and this kind of thing. So all of us who were out on the streets would have different points of emphasis, but all of us would express, because we had it in our dower brochures. We were blessed to at one point to have our own printing press. So we printed up our own brochures and small booklets and this kind of thing. But the emphasis for all of us was that this was uh, the perfect tool of liberation for people of African descent. And we actually added struggling people of African descent. So we presented Islam not as an alternative to Christianity, but as an alternative to a complete change of lifestyle, a complete and object ideology that gives us the tools on how to change ourselves and change the society. We were out there thinking that we were going to establish Islam, probably no more. It wouldn't take any more. We didn't say a time frame, but I know in my mind the way this thing, how Islam, people are going to jump on this, and next 10, 15 years, we're going to have an Islamic state in the United States. And this is the mentality that we approached our dawah and our work, that we were literally thinking that we were going to change the society because of the truthfulness of the message, and because it was from Allah and it was a proven winner. What we were calling people to had been established under the leadership of the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, had such a long history. So we weren't, you know, for us, it was real in that sense.
Do you remember the first time that you gave dawah to somebody and they took the shahada?
It's interesting you would say that. I'm trying to think of the first shahada, um, and I honestly, and I should be able to remember. And I'm not saying this um, braggadocious or anything like that, but Allah has used me, and especially in those early days, like as a dowel machine. And as a result of that, uh, I've given, I don't even want to set a number. I would definitely say hundreds of shahadas, because in addition to the street dawah and this kind of thing, um, I was kind of tagged by Muzaffar early on to give a lot of college lectures and lectures on college campuses, and going into high schools and going into drug treatment centers and these kinds of things. And it's interesting. I was in Burleson, North Carolina, at the Burleson Islamic Center on Saturday, this past Saturday, and I was sitting in the car talking with a brother Jihad, and we were about to go into the Islamic Center there, and a brother walked past, and I looked at his frame in the back, and I didn't see his face, And I told Jihad, I said, you know, if I didn't know any better, I would think that was Brother Mujahid, who was in the Islamic Party in DC. So jumped out of the car, caught up with him, and sure enough, it was Brother Mujahid. And we had a wonderful conversation. But I had given Mujahid Shahada in 1973. And I'd also given his older brother by 2 years his Shahada. And I was explaining to Jihad and another brother that this brother was hard. Mujahid, you know, I had to work really, really hard on that Shahada while his brother, who both of them are still very dear friends. We communicate, they come to Winston-Salem. Um, so those relationships and you know, there are a number of brothers, and like I said, I'm not saying this from a braggadocious kind of standpoint, but whenever I'm in DC, a number of people will come up and say, "Well, Khalid gave me my shahada," and it's just because I was out there so much, and I was a little, you know, zealous in the way I just constantly talking to people about Islam. So I don't remember the first, the absolute first, but I do remember that at one point we'd established what we call the Community Mosque Southeast Center, which was in the southeast part of DC, and the masjid and headquarters was located in Northwest DC. And we started doing Sunday, and I was responsible for Sunday lectures at the mosque, the headquarters, and also I started that in the Southeast Center, and we were able to get a lot of shahadas coming from just that, just a weekly program of inviting people to Islam and describing and talking about certain aspects of Islam.
And but one of the other things I wanted to do was, uh, you know, you've met a lot of people,
Mhm.
and the when I started, I mentioned that there's a lot of people who passed away, and perhaps their story might have been told, but uh, perhaps the you know, the overall Muslim community still doesn't know about them. So I wanted to do this thing. Let me see if I can present this. Here we go. And I'm not gonna tell you who it's gonna be. You're just gonna, where is this?
See who it is.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, you'll see who it is.
Okay. It's not anyone I owe money to, is it?
No, I don't think so,
Okay. Okay.
because I feel like you would, well, there's no doubt you would recognize this brother immediately.
Okay.
Here, let me just do this. This brother.
Yes, that's Imam Yassin Abu Bakr, Rahimullah, who was the Imam of the mosque in Trinidad. And I'm trying to think of for some reason, the name of the mosque
J-
slips me.
is it Jamaat something, right? Jamaatul
Yeah,
Muslimun.
yeah, yeah. It's something like that. And this brother, I met him. I mean, I heard about him. The Islamic Party had established in the late 1970s, like in 1978, probably 1979, had established uh, an operation, a center, which was designated as the headquarters for the Caribbean work of the Islamic. At that time, it became not Islamic Party North America. It dropped to North America because it was no longer North America, and it became just the Islamic Party. And Yassin, at the time that the party was established, was still in Toronto, Canada. He had not moved back to Trinidad at that point. But I heard about Yasin from brothers who were a part of Islamic Party, and they talked about this dynamic, Muslim brother. I actually first met Imam Yasin Abu Bakr in 1988 in London, England, at a Hajj conference. And Imam Yasin, was there, and we spent hours at night just talking about Islam in the Western Hemisphere, and all of this. And by this time, of course, he was back. He was in Trinidad, and he was just as he had been advertised. He's a very dynamic personality. And when I came back to the States and came back to North Carolina, I told brothers that I had met the person who was either going to be the next prime minister of Trinidad, or he was going to either be locked up for life or martyred. And I wasn't saying that sarcastically. It's just that his vision and his drive was such that he viewed Islam not as just a religion, but as a system of life that would change the entire society. So Imam Yasin, uh, in the community where he was the Imam, Jamaat al-Muslimin, where he was the Imam, uh, really, they were at the point, because of their involvement in the community there, that they were just giving shahadas to young brothers and sisters, mostly, almost, yeah, not mostly, I think it was perhaps all, being of African descent. They were Afro Trinidadians who were in large numbers embracing Islam because of the positions and stances that Imam Yassin was taking, and because of his just dynamic kind of attraction. People felt that he was sincere about trying to better the community. So in 1999, I'm sorry, in 1990, Imam Yassin led a takeover, an attempted takeover of the government by occupying what was called the Red House. Like we have the White House here, you know, whatever that represents. Where in Port of Spain they had the Red House, and in the Red House, Imam Yassin and the brothers took over the building, and the deputy prime minister at that time was a Muslim. And to make the story short, the attempt to try to change the government through this takeover was unsuccessful. All of the brothers were locked up. There were quite a few who were with Imam Yassin in the Red House in July, I think, of 1990, who had been members of the Islamic Party. So after the Islamic Party broke up in Trinidad, Imam Yassin had come back to the island, and many of those brothers who were in the Islamic Party were now with Imam Yassin, and I think part of it had to do with they saw the kind of dynamism and commitment in Imam Yassin that they had seen in Muzaffar Hamid. Imam Yassin died just a few, maybe I can't remember, maybe 2 years ago now, and I had gone back to Trinidad in the 90s, like 1998. I went down there for an Emancipation Day program. Some of the former members of the party invited me down to come down and speak. And I spent a lot of time with Imam Yassin when I was down there in 98. And I mean, just wonderful discussions, just analysis of, he was a had a tremendous capacity to analyze social dynamics and what was influencing outcomes in Trinidad and around the world. Um, and the only observation that I would have that motivated me to say that he's going to either be the next prime minister of Trinidad or he's going to be locked up for life or be martyred was I felt just like in Muzaffar, honestly, a little a sense of impatience that, Sabra was, both he and Muzaffar were running 100 miles an hour and they wanted it right now. And I think that that's probably a quality that many folks, Patrice Lumumba, Malcolm, you can just name a lot of folks that who are driven like that, and they see things so clearly and what needs to be done that sometimes there's a sense of impatience. That we got to get this done right now. But he was a person that I was really I felt I've been blessed to have met him, to have had such lengthy discussions with him in England and Trinidad. Um, and, may Allah grant him, forgive his shortcomings and grant him Jannatul Firdaus.
Yeah, I think uh,
Now, that was a surprise.
yeah,
I mean, you're sure, Imam Yassin. Yes.
there's a few documentaries. Like I think I can hear myself, but coming from you.
No, it's
Uh,
not anything spooky or nothing, is it?
no, I just hear myself talking.
Okay, okay.
Yeah,
Like an echo
uh,
or something.
yeah, something like that.
Now,
It's not
you're the
entirely.
tech guy, so I can't help you.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if that's any better. Can you try muting
Okay,
yourself?
surely.
Okay. Yeah, I think. But I remember there's a few like documentaries online on that whole story on Imam Yassin Abu Bakr. I think Vice did something on him several years ago before he passed away. But I remember watching a very old documentary that's on YouTube, and I think it was made in Trinidad. And it's funny to hear because I mean, for me, I like learned about it so many years after all, like 30 years after this whole thing happened. And so it's funny hearing you saying that you thought this guy was going to be the next prime minister of Trinidad. And then that just reminded me of the video that when he and the folks seized the Red House, and then they go on national television and he announces that this morning, the government of Trinidad was overthrown and the president and prime minister have been arrested. I mean, that happened in the Western world, right? In 1990. Whether you agree with it or not, I think as Muslims, like that's a part of our history. Whether you like it or not, that is a part of our history. And it's very interesting to because Trinidad has a large Indian Muslim population. And you were mentioning that most of the folks that were embracing and converting to Islam through this movement that Imam Yassin was a part of were of African descent. And there was this documentary where they went to the Indian Muslims and then they went to the black Muslims. And it's funny or it's interesting because the reasons that these people were saying why they embraced Islam, these African Trinidadian, Trinidadian people, their reasons were very similar to African American Muslims here in the United States. Things like pursuit of justice and things like that. And they were interviewing one of the ladies, one of the women who were part of Imam Yassin's movement, and they interviewed first an Indian Muslim, and he said, overthrowing the government is not the way that you come to power. You have to work democratically and you have to be civically engaged and all that stuff. And then they cut to, Imam Yassin's followers, and one of the women goes, look, there's two ways you can do this. You can have a natural birth or you can have a C-section. We had a C-section because natural birth was not possible. But one other thing that was really telling about Imam Yassin was the fact that here we have hip hop and we have rap in the United States, which at one point was kind of a medium of consciousness, whereas now it's been flooded with a lot of trashy rap music. But in Trinidad, from my understanding, they had like calypso music, and there was a very famous calypso singer. His name was Crow Crow, and he literally wrote a song called "Send a Prayer for Abu Bakr." And when they asked him, "Why do you support Abu Bakr?" he said, "When I saw Abu Bakr, I saw a man. He was a man's man, and he was fighting for us, and he was fighting for the people." And that reminded me a lot of people like Malcolm X, or like you said, Yusuf Muzaffar Hamid. But like him or dislike him, I know I've heard people who really like him and appreciate what he did, and I've heard people who say, well, the way he went about things wasn't the right way that Muslims should conduct themselves in the West when they're minorities. But whether we like him or dislike him, the impact that he had on the community and the message he delivered to the community, the people felt that this guy was fighting for us, and he was a Muslim, and he was fighting for us because he was a Muslim. So whether we agree or disagree, no one is perfect after the no one is without sin after the prophets, peace be upon them. But I feel like as Muslims in America, we have to know and appreciate people like him. So I want to make that something that we do every week, where I just put a picture up there, and then you have to tell us who this guy was and when you ran into him, and maybe if you have like an interesting story.
Sure, sure. That's really good. If I could just add one thing about what you were saying as well. You know, the social dynamics of Trinidad and the Caribbean in general are very similar in many ways to the social dynamics of Islam and the Muslims in South Africa and also in the United States. And by that, I mean that the colonial powers, particularly Britain, and in the case of South Africa, the British and the Dutch, but the Dutch in particular brought Malays who were resisting colonialism in that part of the world, in Indonesia and Malaysia. They snatched the British snatched them up, the Dutch snatched them up and brought them to South Africa because of the resistance that they were getting from their colonial occupation. And when they came to South Africa, many of them were very active in engaging the community and trying to build Muslim communities that were not just places of worship. Of course, they were places of worship, but also they were trying to impact and change the injustices in the society. And similar is the case of what happened in the Caribbean and in Trinidad itself, where the British had all of these colonial holdings. And in about 1834, they felt that it was no longer uh, uh, advantageous for them to be slave catchers and capturers and this kind of thing. So they just, entered into the slave arena from a different perspective. So they officially outlawed slavery in the British colonies in the Western Hemisphere. But and so in 1834, what they said they would do, let's go to India, right? And bring thousands of Indians, transport them to the Caribbean and in Trinidad, and we will tell these Black slaves that they're not ready for independence right now. And in the meantime, we'll train these Indians on how to run the plantations and do all of this work on the plantations, kind of like an overseer. So they were set up as a buffer between the white British colonists and the Black African indigenous people, the people who were Black there. And so this same phenomena is a colonial playbook that the British had perfected, and this was done in the British colonies in the United States, that you get a buffer, you create a buffer between the folks who are really in power and the folks, the general population. And in this country, and I hate to jump all the way back to this point, but in 1965, with the change of the immigration laws in this country that had come off of the shoulders of the struggle of the civil rights movement in this country, that what happened was that the American colonizers look and say, well, if we bring all of these talented uh, Muslims from Asia, from the subcontinent, and other places, if we allow them to come in and have a merit-based system, then the benefits of the civil rights movement, we don't even have to give it to the black people who were lynched and hanged and all this other kind of stuff, who struggled for decades, if not a century, for just basic citizenship rights. We will afford those who are just entering into the country after 1965, many of them were Muslim, we will give them honorary white citizenship. I mean, literally, we'll stamp on their passport that these people are white, and they'll have an honorary citizenship, and they will be like a buffer class, and we can give them the fruits of the labor of the people of African descent who have struggled and died through the civil rights movement. um, would give these benefits to them, and the ones who really, really struggle for it will still be denied because of structural racism. And I'm sorry to go off on that particular tangent, but what Imam Abu Bakr was struggling against, particularly as it related to the total society, part of that struggle was trying to convince many of those descendants of the folks who were brought into the Caribbean by the British, to convince them that, hey, brother, you may have been set up in a superior position than us, but it's because of what somebody else is doing. It's not because of innate inferiority and incapacity and all of these other kinds of things. We are all brothers, so let's treat each other as brothers, and let's work together and interact and this kind of thing. And so I'm really, over the decades, I'm really happy to see that there are so many areas where we still have to work through some things, but there's a growing understanding now about the impact of political and social events, like institutional stuff like structural racism. And and it doesn't mean that because people are in certain locked into certain economic and social positions, that it's because of some kind of inherent inferiority. There's a system that's keeping them down. And what Islamic Party was very expressive about during the 1970s in the United States was emphasizing points like that. Don't come with the stereotypes that a lot of people may have about people of African descent. Sorry to go off on that tangent, but that was uh, you know something I felt strongly about it, so I had to say it.
No, I appreciate it. I think that's one of the reasons why we did this. The echoes coming up again. If you,
Okay, I got you.
yeah, yeah. So, no, I mean, alhamdulillah, I think that was really beneficial, really interesting for us to hear. I think it's just information that, uh, this is information that concerns the Muslim community, uh, because it speaks to, you know, in the last 50 years with the, um, you had the indigenous Muslims who are people who are here who embraced Islam, and then you had immigrant Muslims who came, and even if they disagree with your assessment, your some of the conclusions that you made, I think, I mean, no one can disagree with the facts. The facts speak for themselves, and I think, alhamdulillah, you did a pretty good job of trying to keep it to the facts, although you put some conclusions in there, which I appreciate, and I completely agree with. If we were on the Supreme Court, I'd write a concurrence. So, but yeah, so I think that's been a good discussion, and we can go ahead and close out. And just a note, I know we ran into some technical snags, but hey, that's okay. To those listening, inshallah, we'll work to address them, and we'll keep it going. And I'll leave it to you, Imam Khalid, to make some closing remarks, and then we can go ahead and end this broadcast, inshallah.
Yeah, I think again, I want to express my gratitude and appreciation for a kind of legacy series. Although I don't consider my having any kind of legacy, but I have a keen eye for history and just events, and to be able to share some of the personal experiences and observations, I think is important. We have to be able to understand where we've come from to have a clear vision as to where we're going. If we don't know where we came from, then we can just go off in all kinds of directions. So I think this is a very important series. I commend you, Musab, for uh, you know germinating the idea and then bringing it to a reality, even though it's taken us months to do it, and much of that has to do that's on my part and not on your part. So, alhamdulillah, I look forward to the series.
All right. See you next week, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.
Inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.